I absolutely love witches. I love the concept, the history, the folklore, the aesthetics. I love it all. And at this point, I've read more than 20 books about witches and witchcraft, both fiction and non-fiction. I've talked a lot about these books in various different places, in articles and videos, and here are 3 more witch-related books that I just got through reading and I think you need to check out. One is a non-fiction and the other 2 are novels. All 3 of them are about witches and witchcraft, and specifically about witches within an historical context. These are not set in the modern day, these are historical fiction or historical accounts. Let's check them out. But before I dig into them, I just want to remind you guys that I have a Patreon and I would absolutely love your support. If you enjoy what I do, if you enjoy me sitting here wearing this hat that my partner made and talking about witches, I would love your support on Patreon. First up is the non-fiction book, and I think this is the only book about witches by a man that I've read. So often books about witches are written by women, and rightly so. A lot of narratives about witches are about reclaiming our history, embracing the culture, embracing the aesthetics. I love all of that. But Malcolm Gaskill is an expert on the history of witchcraft. As a professor of early modern history, he is considered Britain's leading expert in witchcraft. And The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World is an exploration, an account of the first case of witchcraft in the United States as it was being settled by Europeans. Settled. Invaded, colonized, destroyed. This is the story of something that happened before Salem. Everyone knows the story of Salem, but this was just a few decades prior to that. This witch hunt or witch trial took place in the town of Springfield, Connecticut. The Ruin of All Witches takes us all the way back to the mid-17th century. The town of Springfield is pretty much what you're picturing. A small collection of wooden houses by a river. And all the people who live there are of British descent. Not just descent, but they are British immigrants. A lot of them come from the home counties around London, like Essex and Sussex, and a lot of them also come from Wales. This is a history book, but it is very much told like a novel. It has a linear narrative that is incredibly captivating. The level of detail, the ways in which Gaskill paints a picture, creates the setting, includes and encompasses the mood and the feelings of the people involved, and then you remember these are all real people. These people actually existed, and everything he's writing here is based on accounts, based on historical records. He's done his research, and here we have the actual thoughts, feelings, and actions of actual people who lived so many hundreds of years ago as the New World was being discovered and colonized by Europeans. Like a captivating novel, The Ruin of All Witches actually begins in media res towards the end of the narrative, with a man who has a nightmare about snakes coming into his home and biting him. And when he wakes up, he knows exactly who to blame. He names the person. That segment ends, and we're thrown back to where this story began. And the main narrative involves a woman called Mary Parsons and her husband Hugh. Mary Parsons was born in Wales. She grew up there and eventually found a new home in the New World and settled in Springfield. We find out early on in the narrative that despite the local people seeing her as kind of a spinster who's leaving it a bit late to get married, Mary in fact already was married back in Wales, but that's a secret. And eventually she marries a local man who is kind of a jack of all trades named Hugh Parsons. There's a bit of speculation about her previous marriage here. Her previous husband back in Wales actually left her, just abandoned her, up and disappeared into the night. And speculation suggests that she wasn't giving him children and he got fed up with that. They were married for about 10 years and eventually he just fucked off. But once she married Hugh in Springfield, the 2 of them had children, so it was probably her first husband's problem. Up until this point, witchcraft was something completely relegated to Europe. This was a problem to be dealt with in Britain, France, Germany, Scandinavia. The New World was free of witchcraft. Until this moment. And what's interesting about this is that the vast majority of witches that were persecuted and tried were women. But the first accusation of witchcraft in the New World happened here, and it was by Mary to her husband. Hugh Parsons, a man, was the first person to be accused of witchcraft. And this is the story of how we got there. How these 2 got married, had children, and she ended up convincing herself that her husband was a witch, and where that led them. Because this is also the story of how Mary was accused of witchcraft, and the two of them both ended up on trial. I won't tell you any more, because how we get there and all of the little details and nuances of this whole narrative are absolutely brilliant. The way that the book explores things like disease, immigration, trade between settlements, all of these things are fascinating. And there are so many aspects to the book that took me by surprise. Like, for example, the mayor of Springfield, who was a kind of low-level academic theologian who ended up getting a book published back in London. And people hated that book. They called it blasphemous because he was quite a rational Christian. And they didn't like that. He wasn't God-fearing enough. And he was a really interesting guy, and his narrative is all in here as well. This is a very dense book. It's only about 200 pages, but there's a lot of density to the detail. And the narrative, as I said, is like that of a novel. I was captivated by the events of this story. This is the first account of witchcraft in the New World, pre-Salem, and it's a very, very worthwhile story to read. Then I read The Witches of Vardor. I don't actually know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I once went to the town of Malmö in Sweden, and I think that's how you say it. I think this little O with a slash through it is kind of an or sound, but Swedish and Norwegian people can correct me, please. Anyway, I'm going to pronounce it Vardor because I think that's right. The Witches of Vardor is a novel by Anya Bergman, and it is absolutely terrific. Similar to The Mercies by Kieran Millward Hargrave, this is a novelization of the actual real-life events of witchcraft on the island of Vardor in Norway. This is an aggressively feminist book, but it's also a really enticing adventure story. The book flits back and forth chapter to chapter between two protagonist narrators. Those protagonists are two women living in the 1660s in Norway, which is almost exactly the same time as the events of this book. Our first protagonist is Ingeborg. She is the daughter of a woman called Sigrid, and they have a pretty tragic family situation going on. Ingeborg's father and older brother have both died out in the water. They were both out fishing, and a storm took both of their lives. This storm really happened. Many of the men on this island suddenly died in this freak storm, and Ingeborg and her mother and her younger sister are now in a really, really dangerous and scary situation. Ingeborg's mother is racked with isolation, sorrow, and she cannot break free of this feeling of mourning that has completely taken over her. In that sense, she's kind of failing as a mother, even more so when she actually accuses her youngest daughter of witchcraft, claiming that Kirsten, Ingeborg's younger sister, caused the storm. So she's not really in her right mind. But there is a local merchant who is now marching around the island demanding money from the families of these fishermen. And Ingeborg's mother decides to sell herself to him because she cannot give him any money. She has none to give. His wife discovers this act and declares Ingeborg's mother to be a witch, and has her sentenced and sent off to this fortress. And Ingeborg wants to free her mother from the fortress. Our other protagonist is a woman named Anna. Anna was in fact a kind of childhood friend of the Prince of Denmark, who later became the king. He didn't expect to be king because he was the second-born son, but it happened. And when she was a kid, her father was the family's doctor. And so she got to know him, and eventually she became his kind of secret mistress. And now she herself, as an adult, married to someone else, having moved on from this but never having let go of the prince and her love for him, has ended up in this fortress as well. And she believes that she's there to root out witches. She believes that there is a plan for her, that the prince hasn't let her down, that she's been sent with altruistic purpose to this fortress. And as the novel goes on, we learn more about Anna, we get her backstory, and she actually tells her chapters to the prince. Her chapters are kind of addressed as letters to him, and so we have a kind of focus on her backstory and her relationship to him, some of which I've told you. But I guess this is more so Ingeborg's story, of her befriending a distant cousin of hers whose mother was also condemned for witchcraft, and how Ingeborg, her younger sister Kirsten, this distant cousin, they're all attempting to try and free Ingeborg's mother, and so they head off to this fortress, and you know that they and Anna are going to end up crossing paths. And that's all I'll tell you. This is a rip-roaring adventure, an aggressively feminist book about witches and patriarchy and accusations and power struggles. But it is also a book full of pretty dark stuff. There are some really traumatizing events in here. There is assault, there is stuff I can't talk about on YouTube. So just bear that in mind. It's not always a pleasant read, although it is full of a kind of righteous anger. And then we have The Bewitching by Jill Dawson. This book might not be for everyone. Again, this is a novel based on real events, this time in England. And the events of this story took place about 50-60 years before the events of the other two books I've discussed. This was the late 1500s in the fens of Cambridgeshire. The Bewitching is much more a literary novel, in its tone, in its themes, in its execution, and that literary style of execution will not be for everyone. Some readers won't get on with this, and I understand. At first I was concerned that I wasn't going to gel with it, that I wasn't going to feel an emotional connection to it, but in time that does come. The Bewitching is a novelization of real-life events that happened in the village of Warboys. I don't actually know if it's pronounced Warboys. I've never been to this village, even though I used to live in Cambridge. There are a lot of towns and villages in the UK with really weird pronunciations, and sometimes Brits make fun of Americans for not knowing how to pronounce certain things, like Worcestershire sauce. But honestly, if we don't know a place, we don't know how to say it. I grew up near the town of Leominster, which is spelled Leominster. And I've met a lot of people in England who've never been to Leominster who think it's pronounced Leominster. So it might not be Warboys, but it's written literally War Boys. Warboys. It could be Wibbis or something. It could be anything. Anyway, Warboys. The Witches of Vardor was a real thing that happened. It involved an entire village of people accusing a local elderly woman called Alice Samuel of witchcraft. Alice Samuel is in this book. In fact, we begin with her perspective. And so just like with the Witches of Vardor, there is an overlap between fact and fiction, between history and storytelling. We begin in the third person with Alice Samuel visiting her new neighbours, who are a pretty wealthy family with a collection of maids and servants. This family are the Throckmortons, and they have been sent to this village so that the patriarch of the family can become the village squire. Alice isn't sure that she likes them or trusts them, and she's taken a minute to go visit them for various reasons, but now she's kind of stumbled in through their door and is just making herself known as their neighbour and saying hello. And they don't like her either. But the kind of main crux of this book is the daughter of the family, a young teenage girl called Jane. She's about 13 years old, and since arriving in the village of Warboys, she's been plagued with fits and hysteria. She gets these intense epileptic-style seizures, and while Alice is visiting in the very beginning of the novel, Jane suddenly shouts out that Alice is a witch. She looks like a witch, she's dressed like a witch, and Jane accuses her of witchcraft. And this is weird, this is maybe a part of her fits, but it sticks in the minds of the family and the servants. Alice is confused, she's a bit freaked out, and she leaves. And from here, most of the novel is seen through the perspective in the first person of one of the maids, a woman called Martha, who's in her early 30s. Martha never married, she's half deaf, and she's a very dedicated maid to the Throckmorton family. Occasionally, the book switches to the third person and we see what Alice is up to and a few other people in the village, but mostly we are in the first person, looking at the world through Martha's eyes. Martha is grounded, she's skeptical, she isn't sure she believes in any accusations of witchcraft, but eventually she does start to come around. This is the story of the Throckmorton family, the story of what's wrong with Jane, the story of their connection to the community, to their own personal friends, to the local people that they're trying to meet, and their accusations of witchcraft that eventually come. The Throckmorton family will eventually accuse Alice of witchcraft, more publicly, and we watch as the village starts to turn against her. This is a story of class divides. This is a story of privilege. This is a story of the powerful accusing a lowly, simple innocent village woman of witchcraft. It's a very literary book, as I said, which means its execution isn't for everyone. It's very, very dense. The way that the chapters are set up, the way that the dialogue is executed, means that sometimes you can get confused and bogged down by what's actually going on. You really have to pay a lot of attention to it. But this is a thematically beautiful book that is absolutely worth your time. The way that it explores relationships, family dynamics, and social dynamics between people within a close community, it's so rewarding to read. I thoroughly enjoyed my time reading The Bewitching. I enjoyed my time with all three of these books, and they're all worth your time if you enjoy witches and witchcraft. I'm always looking for more books about witches, and if you are too, these three books should whet your appetite. If you want even more recommendations, I will link more videos. I will have my full article in the description. Go check that out. There are loads of books about witches there. I love covering books about witches. And if you've enjoyed this yourself, like I said, you can support me on Patreon for just $1 a month. And I have loads of great benefits for my patrons. They're amazing people. So support me on Patreon if you can. Go check out some awesome books about witches and witchcraft. And subscribe for books.